The young corporal's hand shot up in the universal stop gesture, his face set in that rigid mask of authority that comes from 3 months of gate duty and 0 real-world experience. And Major David Richardson, West Point graduate, 12 years of decorated service, Silver Star recipient, commander of an entire battalion, stood there in civilian clothes at the main checkpoint of Fort Bragg, watching this 22-year-old white soldier look at his military ID like it was a library card from another state. And the corporal said the words that would change everything. "Sir, this doesn't look like you. I'm going to need you to step aside." And David felt that familiar cold wash of realization that his rank, his ribbons, his years of sacrifice meant nothing in this moment because this kid saw a black man in a hoodie and jeans, and his brain simply couldn't reconcile that image with the word Major on the ID card. And what this corporal didn't know, what would detonate his world in approximately 12 minutes, was that Major Richardson wasn't just any officer. He was conducting an unannounced security inspection ordered by the base commander himself, and every single thing happening at this checkpoint was being documented by hidden observers. And this young soldier's prejudice was about to become a case study in exactly what the Army was trying to root out. It started 3 weeks earlier in a conference room at the Pentagon, where Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison, one of the highest-ranking black women in the Army, sat across from Major David Richardson and outlined a problem that had been festering across military installations for years. Despite decades of integration and diversity training, service members of color were still reporting being stopped, questioned, and treated with suspicion at their own bases when out of uniform. And the complaints had reached critical mass, with documented cases of black officers being detained, searched, and humiliated by lower-ranking soldiers who simply couldn't see past skin color. And General Morrison needed data, needed evidence that would force systemic change. And she needed someone with the credentials, the composure, and the courage to walk into these situations deliberately and document exactly what happened when a highly decorated black officer appeared at a checkpoint in civilian clothes. David had volunteered immediately, partly because he'd experienced it himself twice before at different bases. That particular flavor of humiliation where you're simultaneously a superior officer and a suspected threat, where you have to navigate the impossible balance of asserting your authority while not being seen as aggressive or threatening. And he'd watched it happen to too many others. Watched talented officers leave the service because they were tired of proving their humanity every time they forgot to wear their uniform to the commissary. So yes, he'd volunteered, and General Morrison had briefed him on the protocol. He would conduct unannounced visits to multiple base checkpoints in civilian attire, present his valid military ID, and simply observe and document how he was treated, with plainclothes investigators positioned nearby to record everything, and Fort Bragg was his third test. And so far, the results had been depressingly consistent. David had driven up to Gate 4 at Fort Bragg on a Tuesday morning, wearing jeans, a Charlotte Hornets hoodie, and sneakers, driving his personal vehicle, a well-maintained but modest Toyota Camry, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed officer, and he'd watched Corporal Jake Henderson, a lanky white kid from somewhere in rural Georgia based on the accent, track his approach with that particular kind of attention that black drivers recognize instantly, that heightened scrutiny that white drivers rarely experience. And David had pulled up, rolled down his window, and handed over his military ID with his vehicle registration exactly as required, and Henderson had taken the ID, looked at it, looked at David, looked back at the ID, and his face had done this thing, this micro-expression of disbelief and suspicion. And instead of the standard "Thank you, Major," "Welcome to Fort Bragg," that any other officer would receive, Henderson had said, "This doesn't look like you." And David had felt his jaw tighten because the photo was from 2 years ago, and he'd had a fuller beard then, but it was clearly him. Same face, same eyes, and he'd said calmly, "That's my current military ID, Corporal. Issued 18 months ago." And Henderson had held it up to the light like he was checking for counterfeit bills, and David had maintained his calm while mentally cataloging every detail for his report. And Henderson had said, "I'm going to need to verify this," and David had said, "That's fine, call it in." But Henderson hadn't called it in to verify. Instead, he'd waved over his supervisor, Sergeant Marcus Webb, a white man in his early 30s with the kind of build that suggested he spent more time at the gym than the library, and Webb had walked over with that swagger of someone who enjoyed exercising authority. Webb had taken the ID from Henderson, examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, and said to David, "You're going to need to step out of the vehicle, sir," with that particular emphasis on sir that made it clear he didn't believe the rank. And David had said, "On what grounds, Sergeant? I've provided my valid military identification and vehicle registration," keeping his voice level and professional, and Webb had said, "Security protocols. We have the right to inspect any vehicle entering this installation," which was technically true but selectively enforced, because David had been watching the checkpoint for 20 minutes before approaching and had seen a dozen white civilians in everything from suits to workout gear breeze through with barely a glance at their IDs. But here he was, a black man in casual clothes, and suddenly protocols were paramount. David had stepped out of the vehicle, hands visible, movements slow and deliberate, because he knew how these situations could escalate. Knew the statistics on black men and law enforcement encounters, even when they were the law enforcement. And Webb had said, "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," and David had said, "I'd prefer to speak with your commanding officer first. I don't consent to a search without proper cause." And Webb's face had hardened because civilians who knew their rights were always more difficult to intimidate. And he'd said, "That sounds like something someone with something to hide would say." And David had felt anger flare hot in his chest, but kept it off his face, kept his voice steady and said, "Sergeant, I'm asserting my rights as both a service member and a citizen, and I'm requesting to speak with your OIC immediately." And Webb had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "The officer in charge doesn't have time to verify every fake ID that comes through this gate." Henderson was shifting uncomfortably now, perhaps sensing that this was escalating beyond normal procedure, and David could see other vehicles backing up behind him, other soldiers and civilian contractors watching this confrontation, and he knew some of them were recording on their phones because everyone records everything now, and that was fine. That was actually part of the plan, because this needed to be documented not just by the official observers, but by regular service members who would see how their fellow soldiers treated a black officer out of uniform. Webb had called for additional security, and 2 more soldiers had arrived. One of them, a black private named Thomas, who met David's eyes for just a moment, and David saw recognition there. Not of him specifically, but of the situation, that silent acknowledgement between black service members who'd both been on the receiving end of this particular form of disrespect. But Thomas said nothing because what could he say? He was a private, and Webb was his supervisor, and speaking up would probably just get him in trouble too. And David understood that calculation intimately. The cost of allyship when you're also vulnerable. Webb was demanding David's car keys now, threatening to impound the vehicle if he didn't comply. And David was calculating his options. He could reveal his identity, call General Morrison's office, and this immediately. But the point of the exercise was to experience and document exactly what happened when a black person, even a black officer, was subjected to this treatment. To show how far these confrontations could go before someone in authority intervened, and so he held his ground, saying, "Sergeant, I've been respectful. I provided valid identification, and I'm requesting proper procedure be followed. Call the Provost Marshal's office if you need verification." And Webb was getting angrier now, his authority being questioned, his judgment being challenged, and he said something that would later be quoted in every newspaper article about this incident. "I know exactly what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at is someone who doesn't belong on this base." Those words hung in the air, recorded by multiple phones, witnessed by dozens of soldiers, and David felt something shift in his chest, a cold clarity, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every black service member who'd heard similar words, who'd been told they didn't belong in uniform or out of it, and he said quietly but with absolute authority, "Sergeant Webb, you're making a serious mistake." And Webb sneered. "The only mistake here is whatever stolen ID operation you're running." And that's when everything changed. Because a Humvee had pulled up to the checkpoint, and out stepped Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the base provost marshal herself, One of the official observers who'd been monitoring the situation from a nearby position and her face was a thunderstorm of professional fury, and she said in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, "Sergeant Webb, step away from that vehicle immediately." And Webb had spun around, his face cycling through confusion and irritation, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm conducting a security inspection of a suspicious individual." And Martinez had walked directly up to David, come to attention, and said, "Good morning, Major Richardson." And the effect of those words was like a grenade detonating in slow motion. And Webb's face went through an entire spectrum of expressions: confusion, disbelief, realization, horror, as his brain tried to process that the man he'd been harassing, threatening, accusing of theft and fraud, was not only a real officer, but outranked him by several degrees and was apparently personally known to the provost marshal. Henderson looked like he might faint. His face drained of color, and David could almost feel sorry for him because the kid was young and had probably just been following his sergeant's lead. But then he remembered the skepticism in Henderson's eyes when he'd first looked at the ID, that automatic assumption that a black man in civilian clothes couldn't possibly be a major, and his sympathy evaporated, because Henderson was old enough to serve his country and therefore old enough to examine his own biases. Martinez had turned to Webb with the kind of cold, professional rage that's more terrifying than shouting and said, "Sergeant, you were provided with a valid military ID bearing the rank of major, and instead of following standard verification procedures, you chose to detain this officer, accuse him of fraud, threaten him with vehicle impoundment, and tell him he doesn't belong on this base. Do you have any idea what you've done?" And Webb was stammering now, trying to explain, saying, "Ma'am, the ID photo didn't match. I was following security protocols." And Martinez said, "You waved through 12 civilians in the last 30 minutes with barely a glance at their IDs. I watched you do it, so don't pretend this was about security protocols. And we both know exactly what this was about." And David watched Webb's face as the full catastrophe of his situation became clear. Watched the man realize that his prejudice hadn't just been witnessed, it had been monitored, documented, and was now going to have consequences that would follow him for the rest of his military career. The investigation moved swiftly because everything had been recorded from multiple angles, because there were dozens of witnesses, because this was exactly the kind of documented case General Morrison had needed to push for systemic reforms. And within 48 hours, the story had spread across military social media, because service members talked and word traveled fast. And suddenly everyone was discussing the black major who'd been detained at Fort Bragg and the sergeant who'd told him he didn't belong. And the conversation was uncomfortable and necessary, with black service members sharing their own stories in a flood of recognition and validation, and white service members mostly falling into two camps: those who were genuinely shocked and committed to being better, and those who insisted this was an isolated incident and everyone was being too sensitive, which told you everything you need to know about who understood the problem and who was part of it. Webb was relieved of checkpoint duty pending a full investigation, and while some argued he was being made a scapegoat, the reality was that he'd said out loud what others thought silently. He'd acted on bias that existed in systems and structures and individual hearts. And yes, he was facing consequences, but those consequences were about accountability, not persecution, about demonstrating that the Army's stated values of respect and equality had to mean something concrete when they were violated. And Henderson received a formal reprimand and mandatory training, and David hoped the kid would learn from this, would examine his own assumptions and grow into a better soldier and person. But he also knew that some people doubled down on their prejudices when confronted, wrapped themselves in defensiveness and resentment instead of choosing growth. Major Richardson submitted his report to General Morrison, 37 pages of documentation covering his experiences at 3 different base checkpoints, showing a pattern of differential treatment that couldn't be explained by anything other than race. And the report became the foundation for new Army-wide training on implicit bias and checkpoint procedures. And David was asked to speak at officer training courses about his experiences. and he wrestled with whether to do it because he was a battalion commander, not a diversity spokesperson, and he didn't want his career to be defined by this incident. But he agreed because silence had never fixed anything. And he stood before auditoriums full of young officers and told them about standing at that checkpoint watching Sergeant Webb decide that his ID was fake, based purely on the disconnect between his rank and his skin color. About the exhaustion of constantly proving you belong in spaces you've earned access to. About his responsibility as a senior officer to ensure that younger service members of color didn't have to face the same barriers. And some of those young officers listened with genuine engagement, and others sat with their arms crossed and skeptical expressions. And David knew he couldn't reach everyone, but if he reached some, if he planted seeds of awareness and empathy that would grow into changed behavior, then maybe the humiliation at that checkpoint would produce something more valuable than anger. Webb requested a transfer to another base and was denied because running from consequences isn't the same as learning from them, and he remained at Fort Bragg under closer supervision. And whether he actually changed his thinking or just learned to hide it better, David never knew, because you can mandate behavior, but you can't mandate belief. You can only create consequences for discriminatory actions and hope that eventually external compliance becomes internal conviction, and maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. But the alternative is accepting that bias is inevitable and unchangeable, and David refused to accept that. Refused to let his daughter grow up in an army that would someday question whether she belonged, despite her father's service and whatever service she might choose to give. The checkpoint incident became a teaching moment that rippled across the military, uncomfortable and necessary, forcing conversations about unconscious bias and the gap between stated values and lived experiences. And some good came from it: revised procedures, better training, increased accountability. But David also knew that he would probably be stopped again someday at some checkpoint by some soldier who saw his skin before his service. Because individual awareness grows slowly and systemic change even slower. But here's what he held on to. He'd stood his ground with dignity. He'd documented injustice instead of just enduring it. He'd forced accountability when it would have been easier to reveal his rank immediately and move on. And that choice to experience the full weight of the discrimination that lower-ranking black service members face daily, that was leadership too. Not the comfortable kind that comes with rank and respect, but the costly kind that requires you to make yourself vulnerable for the benefit of others. And when younger black officers approached him after his training sessions and said, "Thank you, sir. I thought it was just me," he knew that the documentation of his humiliation had validated their experiences and told them they weren't crazy, weren't overly sensitive, weren't imagining the differential treatment. And that validation mattered because isolation is one of discrimination's most powerful weapons, making each victim think they're alone. But they weren't alone. They were part of a pattern, and patterns can be analyzed and addressed and changed. One checkpoint, one conversation, one moment of courage at a time. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to Axiom USA right now, because we're committed to sharing stories that expose injustice and celebrate the resilience of those who fight it with dignity. Hit that like button so this reaches more people who need to hear it. Because every subscription, every share, every comment telling your own story adds momentum to the change we're trying to create. And these stories need audiences who care enough to bear witness and demand better. So join us, engage with this content, and let's build a community that refuses to let discrimination hide in the shadows. Because Major Richardson's experience at that checkpoint matters not just as his story, but as a mirror showing us where we still need to grow. Together, one honest conversation at a time.